the International Day of Tolerance, and this is a United Nations initiative trying to foster understanding, mutual respect and diversity. And to kickstart this discussion around tolerance in the South African context, we are joined in studio by Ms. Khosi Jiyane, a clinical psychologist. Thank you so much for coming through.
Right.
And intolerance couldn't come at, or this discussion couldn't come at a better time, because we've just experienced xenophobia, we see issues of racism. But in your long experience, have you been able to come up with or to identify a common cause or the basis for intolerance in our society?
Well, the most natural basis for intolerance is that it is an evolutionary mechanism, because for survival purposes, we have had to, as the human species, to distinguish between what is safe and what is a threat. And so in its natural basis, it is not a bias that is intended to act in threat of the survival of the species, but rather it's supposed to enhance our survival. But then it obviously has its social, political connotations, religious, and so on, that then evolve beyond just the natural survival instinct.
And speaking of the social and political differences South Africans have, because we've got a layered and complicated history,
We do.
what do you think, or who do you think is responsible for sensitizing citizens about how to be tolerant, or tolerance to be expressed all the time? Whose responsibility is that?
I think it is a social responsibility through all the institutions of society that are responsible for socialization. So in our first and most primary context of socialization is our family of origin, so significant others from our early on upbringing, because we as the human community are socially scripted, and so we are written into by those that come before us in our society, that receive us into the broader community, and they script into us what is good, what is bad, what we should and shouldn't, the in-group, the out-group dynamics. And so this is where it all begins. So by the time we actually broaden our horizon of social interaction beyond the home, we already are written into, and so that is our most primary source of socialization. And of course it expands, and those other institutions of socialization, such as school, such as your community and the world of work and the broader global community, is a space where we negotiate those spaces of tolerance and intolerance. So we can then either broaden our horizons, or it can get reinscribed, and therefore we can narrow down and really hold on to those initial scripts as facts, and actually get lost to the fact that they actually are just interpretations. Each one of them are interpretations, and therefore subject to renegotiation.
And I might be putting you on the spot a bit here, but we've seen the case that comes to mind now is where we heard AfriForum is building a university, that Afrikaans-speaking university. And for many black people, or for many activists, or for many politically conscious people, they see that as a intolerance, and people just want to exclude them. You think of a town like Orania that wants to be by themselves. How do you think intolerance plays a role in all of these things that are happening in our country, in terms of, I'll use the AfriForum, not per se, but those kind of situations where we find organizations that want to just to advocate for their own interests, where we have a very diverse country, but people still pushing for things that are politically, are viewed as intolerance.
Well, you said you put me on the spot here, and I'll take that spot. Because, and I'll give you my personal opinion, and this is not necessarily a professional opinion. I think I understand, on some level, I can hear that people have the right, and it is a personal inclination for us to wish certain things for ourselves, right? Individually and collectively. And so on one hand, I hear that. But on the other hand, I think for me, the bigger problem, particularly in South Africa, in our racialized society, even though we are in transition through that process, my question is really, what is our need as black people to be liked by white people? That's why does it make us feel so unwanted when they don't like us? Is there something in us that we cannot love ourselves? Can we not be enough on our own? So that we are asking those questions from a space of emptiness. But my sense is that we still have not recovered from that sense of being emptied by our history. And so we are still hungering for validation, for acceptance, for embrace, for love, in spaces where we shouldn't really be looking as our primary source of validation. So that's just my...
No, I hear you. Yeah. And now, I'll say the black community, and I'll use the capital B, black, I mean people who are not white, basically. In the black community, you find intolerance, because you find people... I've been asked before if I'm Tsonga, because people just look at me and think, oh, he's dark, he's got a flat nose, he could be Tsonga.
Yeah.
But what informs, is it some sort of social illiteracy that's going on in our communities, or are we, just tell me what is going on, because in that same black community, you have the LGBTI community, that people will use religion against them, and we don't like each other.
Yeah.
And can I boil it down to self-hate? Is that why? Are those some of the traits that sponsor intolerance?
There are multiple selves in society, and we need to have room to, first of all, recognize that. So consciousness is our biggest ally on this journey, in the sense that we need to recognize there's a multiplicity of selves, as you have boiled them down, that within black, there's different levels of blackness and nuances to our blackness. So it is about recognizing that, and secondly, understanding where does my particular script that I hold on to that informs my relationship to this multiplicity come from. And by the same token, then recognize that other people equally have their own scripting and their own social journey that they have gone through that places them where they come from. And therefore to rather come from a place of curiosity and openness to saying, can I take myself out of my world and for a moment invite myself into your world to understand where you come from, what makes you who you are, and can we negotiate a point of even saying, can we agree to disagree on certain things? That tolerance says, if it were up to me, I would not have it this way. But nevertheless, I respect the fact that you also are entitled to a self, an opinion, both of us are opinions in a sense. We are construct in a sense. And so therefore, I can recognize the ability for you to be yourself while also acknowledging my own.
And I'm glad you're an academic, and I read a lot of research stuff, and you often see, I think researchers sometimes are just happy writing.
Of course.
South Africa is a violent country, and I think the root of it is intolerance, or well, maybe part of it. But I haven't discovered research that it educates us or educates people like me, journalists, who are supposed to tell stories of intolerance and the repercussions thereof. And a point in case is Rwanda, just calling people cockroaches started a genocide. It wiped a whole population off. But the messaging that our politicians use also, could that also be informing the reason why we continue to be a violent country?
Of course, there are those people that are influencers in society who, when they speak, people defer to their opinion. And their opinion is rather even more construed as more like fact than opinion, and people defer their own responsibility to think and question for themselves and rather just fly on those people's borrowed wings, and therefore it shuts down the opportunity for people to engage meaningfully and for a person to understand what is my own truth on this issue and can it coexist with another person's, and therefore we foreclose on issues and it becomes an either or, so that opinions become mutually exclusive, and that is where we end up with situations like the genocide. And when that moves from a collective sense of being to becoming a collective consciousness, this is when you see people en masse moving towards those sorts of genocidal behaviors.
But what does it do to, because I'm going to use another example. We saw when the Springboks came back, and the country is very racially polarized, and there couldn't have been another way to find out than when the Springboks came back that other people were saying. We saw EFF, Julius Malema tweeting, not even him, we said in Lozi saying, congratulations to Siya Kolisi, and the rest can go to the
other place,
the Prince, to get their congratulations. But what does that do to the psyche of a nation when a party like the EFF has such a massive following?
Well, on the one hand, it says it is not business as usual It is not all glory days as we would like to. So there's many discourses that are competing for social consciousness, for the social space, for the individual mind. And so there are multiple voices. So in the same breath that there has been so much celebration and jubilation, you've seen people at bars, at restaurants and places for a moment forgetting about our racial polarization and saying there is one thing that unites us right now, and it is that we are South Africans. And as a country, we have won. We feel part of that celebration. And yet within that, as a mass consciousness, there are also other voices that will speak to the contrary. And so it is those are the spaces we are constantly navigating around, moving forward in terms of change, but also the resistance to the change. So in society, there's always in social evolution that negotiation between consistency with the past and evolution moving forward and leaving that behind.
But now I'm sure you deal with clients one-on-one, I think, and maybe sometimes groups. But now we have 57 million people racially polarized, and we have
racially diverse. I wouldn't necessarily say racially polarized.
Oh, we can debate that another day.
Within our diversity, there is polarization,
okay,
but our starting point is diversity.
Okay, you win this one. Okay.
Yes.
But you know, there are national projects that did not really have a serious impact in uniting us as a country, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as a clinical psychologist, what kind of national project do you think will have an impact, a positive impact that will promote social cohesion and we stop this racism, basically?
Yeah, I think the one thing we need to do as South Africans is to recognize that it is not just us. We seem to have this notion of a uniqueness of our experience. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a universality of this kind of experience in the human community millennially. Over the years and ages, we've always had that sense of discrimination. I mean, I was in Malaysia some years ago, and the same places, there are places where you go and they tell you, if you are here and you are this kind of race in this community, don't expect to actually come out alive, or don't expect people to embrace you. So those things are part of our journey. It has certainly been punctuated in South Africa in our history, and it is more recent perhaps than other communities. But what I'm sensing is that it is not as intense as it used to be before, because it is not as concretized as it was in legislation, in resources, in the allocation of resources, in the whites only and so on, that have made it so concrete. So those boundaries are lowering. It is simply like the Berlin Wall coming down. So it doesn't necessarily mean that by its coming down all attentions have ceased. They will continue to be there, but they will de-escalate over time, and we have new generation of people that are coming into the society. So it is evolving, it is moving. We just need to embrace the fact that there's pockets of both going on, but it will not ever cease to be, because that's the nature of being human, and it's part of our human evolution to discriminate in one way or other.
That's very true, and we could talk about this
we could
whole
indeed,
day, because this is such an interesting discussion about tolerance, because South Africa is just a layered and complicated nation, and one moment we are the euphoric, one
yes,
moment we are united against someone, and so forth.
Yeah, and let me touch on this so-called xenophobia issue. Because
I want to know why you call it so-called xenophobia.
Because I do not believe that those attacks were based on the fact that I hate you because you are a black person. I am killing you because you are black. It is not. It is simply because there is a large majority of the African community that collectively are at the bottom of the socio-economic globally. And we are competing with people that are way ahead, countries that are way ahead of us. And we know the history of colonization, we know the history of slavery, and we are still suffering the repercussions, both from the colonizers' point of view, but equally from a failed leadership in our continent as Africans. And therefore, a large majority of our communities and our populations are scrambling for the bottom. The people that are here because there is a shrinkage of a livelihood in their own communities. And so it is natural for people to gravitate where they think there is a possibility of earning a living of some sort. And Of course, there's always less resources than there are people. The African population, is far bigger than the resources that are available. And so there is a scramble. It is a socio-economic issue. It is not a racial issue. Because if you take the fact that at universities, there are students from all African countries and all global countries. We are not fighting at those places. In our workspaces at the professional level, we work with people from all over Africa. Nobody is fighting because it's a different space. But at the bottom, where the number exceeds the resources, there is a scramble.
And
it
there
is
are less
not
educated people.
Exactly, it is not a xenophobic issue. That just is the tip of the iceberg. It shows up because we are embodied selves, and our embodiment says we are black, we are African, and therefore that becomes the easiest hook to which we pin this whole issue. It's a far more complex issue than just xenophobia.
You know what? If I ask you a follow-up question now, you'll have to stand in as a politician too, because this is such an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
And I would love to have you back so we can explore this, especially on the xenophobia part of it, because that's a very interesting perspective. I haven't seen it anywhere when I've been reading about this. But now we're going to wrap it up, and thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Khosi Jiyane, clinical psychologist. Thank you for coming to the agenda. And while we're taking a short break, we're still setting the agenda after the break.